Good morning, everybody, and welcome to our first live webinar as part of our Ascend virtual series. You know, it's an interesting time across the world, and particularly for the building industry. And last year, not even thinking about the changes in the way we work, the way we think, the way we create across the world, we started the Ascend Innovation Conference and built through our Council on Innovation and Best Practices. It really is a forum to convene honest discussions about ways to drive real change for the future and improve on New York City's built environment. And not just New York City, but I think some ideas on how to really help build the country and the world. For today, let me thank our sponsor, who's really been phenomenal, Turner Construction and Charlie Murphy. Charlie is one of the co-chairs of our Innovation Council, along with some incredible co-chairs, Carl Galeotto of HOK, Jill Lerner of KCF, and Tom Scarangello, who helped start this many years ago, of Thornton Tomasetti. Today's program is something we've been talking about for a long time. It's a conversation on closing Rikers and building 4 borough-based jails. And really a discussion about why this is a critical step towards decarceration in New York City, but also an opportunity to reimagine what the jail system of the future looks like. And with an eye for our industry, of course, how we build it, how we design it, how we create it. The people on the panel today are, when I tell you phenomenal, I'm gonna let our moderator talk about them, but I do wanna thank our panelists. In a moment of crisis, a moment where it's not just health, it's not just economy, but it's really social justice, racial inequality, and a moment to move forward. I like to say we're all in this together. And this is a moment where we really need to get this borough-based jail program done. So let me turn it over now to our moderator, the one and only Elizabeth Velez, president of the Velez organization, and of course, the chair of the New York Building Congress. Liz, I turn it over to you, and everyone, thank you.
Good morning, everybody, and welcome to Ascends 2020. Thank you for tuning in today. As Carlo mentioned, this is a very important conversation and an opportunity for the building industry to understand the greater impact of the projects we design and build in New York City and its communities. In the spring of 2017, the city committed to closing the jails on Rikers Island and creating a network of modern and humane borough-based jails. This smaller jail system, built on a foundation of dignity and respect, would house a jail population of approximately 5,000 citywide. This borough-based jail system would strengthen connections to families, of course, attorneys, courts, medical and mental health care, and faith and community-based organizations. The new facilities would serve as a catalyst for positive change within our communities and our criminal justice system. And so I'd like to welcome a phenomenal panel today to discuss this very important issue and program initiative. Our panelists include Jennifer Jones-Austin, CEO and Executive Director, Federation of Protestant Welfare Agencies, Gary LaBarbera, President, Building and Construction Trades Council of Greater New York, Judge Jonathan Littman, former Chief Judge of New York State of Counsel at Latham & Watkins LLP and Chair of the Independent Commission on New York City's Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, Stanley Richards, Executive Vice President, the Fortune Society, and Jamie Torres Springer, First Deputy Commissioner, New York City Department of Design and Construction. So let's get right into our questions all, starting with Judge Littman. You chair the Independent Commission on New York City Criminal Justice and Incarceration Reform, which issued a set of recommendations for improving the city's criminal justice system. Can you provide us with an overview of the Commission's recommendations and why closing Rikers and establishing borough-based jails is essential to creating a more just New York?
Sure. I'm glad to start things off.
Yes.
Let me say that the basic conclusion of the commission was that Rikers is a disaster on every front, falling apart, literally, a violent, miserable place, isolated, very hard for families to visit, ridiculously expensive. It costs roughly $500,000 per year per person to keep Rikers going. It is 90% of the people are pre-trial, meaning that they haven't been convicted of anything, and yet they're in that horrible place. And it has massive racial disparities, with almost 90% of the people there are people of color. Our conclusion was that incarceration should be the last resort, that the mass incarceration model that Rikers represents doesn't work. This idea of one way in, one way out of sight, out of mind. We've made tremendous progress in lowering the population there from 9,500 3 years ago to about 4,300 today. And our goal is to get even lower, down into 33 or 3,500 by 2026 or 27. We are leading the nation in many regards, but we still have work to do with passing parole reform to get out people just there with technical violations, to speeding up the cases in the courts, which I'm very familiar with. And decarceration, and don't make any mistake about it, has not impacted public safety. The latest NYPD data shows absolutely no linkage between the new bail reform law and COVID-19 releases. In fact, we're a safer city today than we were before de Blasio was elected in 2012. We have to replace Rikers with borough-based facilities that are closer to families, closer to courts and important services, with better reentry outcomes, build places with light and air that have an economy of scale, that provide a better environment for people when they get out of jail, a better place for people who are locked up, a better place for their loved ones, and a better place for those who work in the jails. Borough-based facilities are critical. That's how we're going to close Rikers, by building new locally based jails. It would cost billions more to build it on Rikers Island. We need a smaller, more efficient system, and we will save more than $500 million a year, even accounting for capital spending, once these local jails are being built. And we can replace Rikers with an environmental infrastructure that makes sense, such as sewage treatment plants and solar power. Put that on Rikers Island and backfill in the counties with affordable housing, commercial development. So on every level, the commission recommends that this just accelerator of human misery has to be taken down now, and replaced again with smaller, more humane jails that treat people with respect and dignity. That's the basic recommendation of this commission.
Thank you, Judge Lippman, for starting our conversation off on such a great path in support of the Borough-Based Jails program on every level, right? Social, economic, every level. I want to pivot now to Jamie. Jamie, DDC, Department of Design and Construction, is the agency overseeing the demolition of the existing jails and the construction of the 4 borough-based jails. Can you provide us with an overview of the current status of the project?
Sure. Very happy to have a chance to do that, and particularly to talk to the design and construction community represented by the Building Congress. And I do want to start off by saying we very much view this program, along with all of our other work, as a partnership with the construction industry, and we've been working very hard to figure out how to structure that partnership so that we can deliver on the lofty but just goals and aspirations that Judge Lippman has articulated this morning. So the program is moving forward through procurement, design, and construction. We did have a pause in the spring due to the disruption of COVID. We expect that's going to cause minor impacts to the schedule. We're still studying exactly what that means, but figure that it will be relatively minor. But we are proceeding full steam, And I can say that we expect to NTP to issue a notice to proceed on registered contracts for work on all 4 sites in the 4 boroughs by the end of next year, by the end of 2021. We also very pleased and excited that we do have design build authorization for this program. And we've been working very hard to make DDC an owner of choice for design build partnerships. We brought on a program management consultant team that's assisting us. We've got a draft of a design build agreement that takes advantage of best practices in structuring design build around the country and around the world. We've been looking at best practices for delivering through design build and also for delivering on criminal justice reform and within physical buildings. So we're very excited about how we're moving. The first RFP was released to a short list that was pre-qualified over the summer. That's for the construction of a garage in Queens. We expect that we'll have RFPs out for the design and building of the facility in Manhattan and for the dismantling and site remediation, site prep for the other 3 facilities in the coming months. And you know, the community should expect to see additional RFQs for dismantling and facilities coming very soon.
Thank you so much. And, you know, I'm speaking on behalf of the industry. I know you would agree. We're thrilled that we have the design build procurement pathway for usage throughout New York City on some of these major projects. It's essential. Stanley, you are a member of the commission with Judge Littman and serve as a co-chair of the Working Group on Design, a subcommittee of the Justice Implementation Task Force. The 4 borough-based jails will be smaller, safer, and fairer facilities. How do we provide improvements for people in detention through the design of these modern facilities?
Thank you for having me. I'm so pleased that we're having this conversation, because this is a conversation about how our criminal justice system will show up in New York City. We've seen the damage that the current system has perpetuated in communities disproportionately impacted by Black and Brown communities. And we have a moment right now. We've seen what design and construction can do to a landscape. We've seen how design and construction, what that can do in terms of where people live and how they experience the buildings. We have an opportunity to do that with the borough-based facilities. I have a saying where I say, hurt people hurt people. And what we have right now on Rikers Island is a system that is not conducive to the job the correction officers are charged to do. It is not consistent with the humanity of the people that are detained in those facilities. And we have a moment now to design something that speaks to that very humanity, the humanity that we all agree exists in all of us. At Fortune, we have a saying, we say, the crime is what you did, it is not who you are. And so we need to design for user principles that we know the people who are going to work there, the people who are going to visit, the people who are going to be detained, those design principles are embedded in the humanity that we all share. And so as Judge Littman said, we have an opportunity to have facilities that are designed for community, that are designed for programming and support, that allows light to come in, that doesn't speak to the crime the person committed, it speaks to the humanity of that individual and of that officer. And so we are encouraging many architects and designers and builders to participate in this process. This is a process that a designer can talk to their grandchildren and great-grandchildren and say one day, they had a footprint in building out a system that was designed for the humanity of men and women and not for the incarceration of them.
Terrific. And on that note, the impact onto the community, Jennifer, how will a decentralized jail system benefit incarcerated people and their families? And what impacts will the new facilities have on the communities on which they're located?
So I am glad to be joining all of you, and I am of I'm like-minded when it comes to the value add of a decentralized jail system. Several years ago, when I worked for the Bloomberg administration in City Hall, we developed an alternative to placement program for young persons, bringing them closer to home. And what we found is that by having them closer to home, they were better able to maintain connections to their family members, to friends, sometimes, better influences rather than negative influences. We found that that there was greater visitation, greater engagement, continuity of program and service delivery, that community-based organizations working with young persons were better able to connect with them while they were in detention closer to home. We believe that some of the same can be achieved through a decentralized system. And so, one of the greatest challenges for individuals and families when incarcerated is the lack of family engagement. And we know that that creates generational trauma, intergenerational trauma, especially for children of incarcerated parents. So I think that's going to be a really, really big win. And then having people feel like they're still part of the community, and also having people outside of the community recognize that the experience of persons who become detained, that's their experience as well. It's not off in some distant land where you don't have to pay attention to what the impacts of that are. Now, let me say that I'm all on board with this, but I do think that we have to be cautious, and we have to appreciate that just because you decentralize the jail system doesn't mean now that we've changed ideologies, how we think about detained persons, how we think about mass incarceration, how we think about Black and brown people who've been oppressed, marginalized, racialized for centuries. Just because you move jails into communities doesn't mean that you get rid of the oppressive features of jails. So unless this change in location comes with a change in ideology concerning poor persons, people of color, understanding the link, the inextricable link that this society has created between race, poverty, and justice involvement, unless you begin to change that, we're just gonna move the Rikers problem into the communities. And the last thing I'll say is, what's the greatest evidence of that? People say, how can racism still be alive in America? We have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, affirmative action, the Fair Housing Act, and I go on and on and on. What legislation and policy does is it changes the law. It says you must abide by or adhere to, or you will be in violation. But it doesn't automatically change minds, values, and beliefs. And so unless with this borough-based setup comes a change in ideology about how we engage with poor people and people of color in this city and in this nation, we'll just move the Rikers problem to the communities.
Thank you, Jennifer. And I love how you put together the whole importance of ideology and leadership and how we have to use those changes for community empowerment, economic empowerment, and physical empowerment. I love it. Wonderful. Jamie, how is the city approaching planning and the design process of the jails that ensures full inclusion and participation of outside stakeholders, including community members, impacted people, and advocates? And has there been any impact on the program's budget for the city of New York?
Let me address the last question first, which is that the project remains fully funded in the 10-year capital plan. So as I mentioned, we did have the design and some of the procurement activities on hold for a period during the spring, which will have some minor schedule impacts that we're still looking at, but we do have a fully funded project to the tune of $8.7 billion. So this is a major investment of capital by the city, and we have the funds that we need in order to do it. The other question you ask is absolutely critical to not only the success of a construction program, but also to living out the ideals that both Stanley and Jennifer and the judge have spoken to. So we know that we need to be responsive to issues of racial justice and the driving need for incarceration reform. And of course, we're also building significant new civic assets in 4 neighborhoods across the city. And so we have to be very responsive to community concerns in the same way we do about any major project that has impacts in a neighborhood. So we have a very strong program. We've been holding community design workshops in each of the areas of the city where the projects will be constructed. There was a very extensive outreach process prior to the approvals that the city council gave, and now that's passed on to us, and we're supporting an interagency team to do that community design workshops. We're having justice advocate design workshops. All of that informs the design guidance that we'll put in the RFPs, and then we'll be working very intensively with the design builders to make sure all of that thinking is incorporated. Of course, in that community engagement, we're all living in a very challenging environment, but DDC has had a lot of success doing remote engagement, and we look forward to being back out there in the future. I'll also say we've set up a system of regular program updates and reviews for elected officials, the neighborhood advisory committees that were created during the Euler process, of course, the community boards, and then also we're accountable to the City Planning Commission and the Public Design Commission, and also have engaged some architectural design review by outside experts that are familiar with both building great buildings and also delivering on this promise of incarceration reform and finding a way to create environments that drive behavior and produce outcomes. So we have a very strong program of engagement teed up both at the community level, justice advocate level, and citywide as well.
On that note, let's now move to criminal justice and incarceration reform. Thank you for that, Jamie. You know, that real simple, easy discussion on criminal justice and reform. This question is open to whomever would like to take it. New York City has made progress over the past years in lowering the number of people in jail. What additional reforms are necessary in order to continue reducing incarceration, such as bail and discovery reforms, limiting delays, and reforming New York State's parole systems? Anyone can jump in.
Let me start that one and just say that, look, I think criminal justice reform is essential in this state and this city. And at the heart of that is to take down places that are incubators of violence. That, you know, Rikers is a stain on the soul of our city. And it is so, ending mass incarceration and that model is essential to criminal justice reform. It's the most important piece of criminal justice reform. And it is, if there's one area that our resources should be devoted to, it's the criminal justice reform, ending mass incarceration, and then continuing to look at the bail laws. You know, we changed the bail laws, and then there's been a modification of that. We're continually looking at how to make our criminal justice laws better. And the bottom line is that if people are nonviolent and not going to hurt somebody, they should be home with their families and their communities, have their jobs. If they're violent and they're going to hurt somebody, then we incarcerate them. But barring that, and that's what bail reform is about. So we have to continue that effort to change the bail laws and to make them fairer. And again, right now they discriminate against people of color. That's what the new laws are about, to make it equal justice for everybody. So we need that. We need continued discovery reform, which means that the evidence that the prosecutor has to be given over to the defense so everyone gets a fair shake in this city. We need to reduce case delays, where I know, I lived through it, that the criminal justice system can be very, very counterproductive in terms of taking years till we get things accomplished. That has to be done now. And my successor, Chief Judge DiFiore, is doing just that. And I think I mentioned it before, we need to reform New York's parole system, where right now people are kept in jail for technical violations of the law. that they don't belong there. And again, the bottom line is, if you're not going to hurt somebody, why are we wasting the taxpayers' monies to keep you there? So criminal justice reform is not for the short-winded. We've started on this path, and we have to continue along those lines, because we need to decarcerate, put less people in jail. And again, the whole purpose of this session today, build new, modern, smaller, more cost-effective, and most importantly, more humane facilities to bring those criminal justice reforms alive, because you can't reform the law and still keep people in these horrible places that are an affront to humanity.
And I would add, I agree everything Judge Lippman said. We also need to work on prevention. And this gets to what Jennifer was saying, that we have systemic racism that disproportionately impacts Black and brown people. And we need to work further upstream in our investments as a society. We invest billions of dollars in mass incarceration. We invest billions of dollars in policing and protection. We don't proportionally invest that in education for our communities, in higher wages for some of our workers. And so we need to make sure that we're working two parallel tracks. One is the systemic criminal justice reforms that Judge Lippman talked about, bail reform, parole reform, speedy trial, the conditions of confinement. But we also need to start thinking about, how do we prevent so many people from going into the criminal justice system? What is so exciting for me about this conversation as a Black man, as a formerly incarcerated person, I feel like for once in my life, I have children and I have grandchildren. I feel like at some point I can begin to have a conversation with my grandchildren that talks about the values of this city, that the values of this city shifted from planning their incarceration to planning investments in their education, planning investments in their economic stability. And we're at that moment, but it's going to take all of us pulling in the same direction, dealing on parallel tracks.
You know, if I may just quickly add, piggybacking on what Judge Lippman said and on what Stanley Richards said. Several years ago, I was asked to join the Board of Correction. And at the time that I was asked to join, I initially hesitated. I resisted because I thought, I've been in the anti-poverty, social policy, and advocacy space working for nearly 20 years, and I haven't really done a lot of work in criminal justice reform and no work with the jails. And so I thought, I'm not going to take up a seat on this board and keep somebody else with more knowledge and experience from tackling these issues. And then after a lot of back and forth, I determined to do so. It didn't take me long walking through Rikers and other jails to appreciate that there was a place and a space for me to be on that board, because our city, our state, and our nation focuses on criminal justice reform with a criminal justice centered lens only. And the intersection between justice involvement and poverty and race, as I said a moment ago, is too great to be ignored. If you look at the 10 community districts in New York City with the highest rates of people of color and poverty, they correlate directly with the highest rates of incarceration. Is that simply because Black people commit more crimes than white people? No, it has everything to do with our policing systems and with the lack of resources that are afforded people in these communities. And then add to that, in this COVID moment, you want to look at the communities? I would venture they're the very same communities, save a couple here and there in Queens. They're the very same communities. And so we're going to see, with people losing jobs as a consequence of COVID and having to struggle to care for their families. The greatest number of people in prison, they've shown there's a great correlation with poverty. People just don't commit crimes because they're bad people. They're struggling. So if you really want to engage in criminal justice reform, you also have to engage in fighting poverty. And that's something that we failed to do as a nation, to bring the two together.
Thank you, all of you. And my takeaway is, especially, is that reform means change on every level. When we talk about reform, continuing down the discussion, and this is open for all, on the massive racial disparities that exist in our jail system, and how we must address this at every level of government, inside and outside of the criminal justice system, particularly by police and district attorneys. So what immediate and long-term steps should be taken to confront the systemic issue?
Well, let me just raise one issue that I think is critically important and critically important to people of color. I think that legal representation of people in need of defense services who don't have the money to afford an attorney is critically important to ensure that everyone is treated equally in the justice system, and that we don't have two systems of justice, one for those with resources or a dime in their pocket, and those who don't, and one for the majority and one for the minority. So I think legal representation is critically important, and just as important as, again, focusing on police practices and on criminal justice reform. I think it's all important. And also, you know, I would say that redefining the roles of all of the players in the criminal justice system are very important. And in particular, I mentioned the corrections department and people in the jails that work in the jails. We have to redefine that role. So it's about helping people and not just about punishing people. And I think that's essential, because otherwise, as Jennifer had mentioned before, you're going to wind up taking what's in Rikers and just putting it into smaller jails around the city is not going to help us. We have to change the culture, and we have to begin to, again, treat people with the dignity that they deserve, so that if you treat people that way, you get respect and dignity in return. So changing the culture is very important.
And if I may add, key to changing the culture, I couldn't agree more, is centering on racial bias that plays out in everyday life and in everyday practice. A few days ago, I had a conversation with a former family court judge, and he was talking about the fact that as a judge, he presided over, when he first got on the bench, he was given a caseload, 1,000 cases, and that he had to manage on any given day as many as 35 to 40 cases. And he said, when you're overwhelmed and you're saturated, you know, looking at one case after the next, you can't help but bring your own personal background and bias into your decision making. He was very honest in sharing that. And he said, you know, he said, I'm a white Jewish man who grew up in Queens. I don't know and understand the experience of somebody living in an impoverished environment in Bedford-Stuyvesant or Brownsville. I don't know it. So he said when he was presiding over family court cases, he was bringing his background into what he believed was right and what he believed is wrong. We can only change culture when we also lean in and understand who's showing up as correction officer, who's showing up as judge, who's showing up as juror, and how they're bringing their own biases to the decision making.
I agree, and I would add, I did some work with John Jay's Center on Innovation in Prosecution, and they convened a number of district attorneys throughout the country to really begin to examine their role in the criminal justice system and how much influence and impact they can have just by the decision to charge, not charge, the decision to require incarceration versus not requiring incarceration. And there's this conversation that's happening nationally that we can't achieve full criminal justice reform if we do not include reforms in policing and reforms in prosecution. Prosecutors have a pivotal role in making sure that our system is reduced and is not focused on mass incarceration, they have the authority to do that just by their charging authority.
Thank you. Let's pivot now to community and organizational response. And I want to talk to Gary. Gary, you are such a leader in our construction industry. How is the Building and Construction Trades Council engaging with lower income communities through pre-apprenticeship and direct entry programs to provide a pathway to careers in the building trades?
Well, first, thank you very much, Elizabeth. And it is a pleasure to be on this panel, certainly with my fellow panelists. And I just want to make one personal comment. I have known and grown to respect the work of the judge, Lippman, over the years. And it is really an honor for me to be on this panel with you, Judge. It really, truly is. So let me address that question. And I'd like to just share a few of my comments. To this point, I've deferred, but I want to say this. I believe what I've heard today is absolutely correct. And to Jennifer's points, in particular, about the correlation between poverty and incarceration, and poverty and crime. I have been saying, literally for the last 20 years of my life, in when I really gained the pulpit in this industry, that the best anti-poverty and the best anti-crime program is a meaningful job. I believe that employment opportunities, when I heard Stanley talk about the billions of dollars that are invested in the criminal justice system that could go into schools and candidly go into creation of good family-sustaining jobs, we're not doing something right, because that's where the investment needs to be. Not in bigger jails or more incarceration, but rather in opportunity. And with that theme, we had just entered into an agreement with the City of New York on the Project Labor Agreements, which is really focused on creating significant opportunity for communities that are disadvantaged, in particular communities that have more than 15% of their population that are below the federal poverty line. And I'm sorry to say that when I actually was in these negotiations with the City of New York, and I looked at the map, well over 50% of communities in the 5 boroughs fall into that category. So Jennifer, to your point, I think you're very, very accurate. And in many of those underserved communities, absolutely is where levels of incarceration are significantly higher than in others. So there's clearly a double standard. And again, getting back to my earlier thoughts and comments, I'm a firm believer in opportunity, and I'm a firm believer in creating opportunity through good, really, truly family-sustaining jobs. And in my world, that means a union job with good wages and benefits and dignity and respect, working in a safe environment, and be able to retire, something to work for, and retire with dignity and respect. And so we've done something very historical in the Project Labor Agreement, but I do want to take a little bit more time to talk about one of the programs, which is a pre-apprentice and direct entry program known as P2A, that the building trades has become very, very supportive of. And this is Pathways to Apprenticeship. And this program particularly focuses on justice-involved individuals. And what we are doing is working very closely with a number of organizations to identify these individuals, get them into these pre-apprentice programs, and then ultimately into an apprentice program. And I can tell you that the success is staggering. And for me personally, having interacted with so many justice-involved individuals that has been given that opportunity, that's what they've been looking for. That's what it's been all about, giving them the opportunity to be able to have an income, that they can have an apartment, eventually perhaps buy a home, raise a family. To say this is, I mean, again, Jennifer, you're so on about these biases and these stigmas. I believe that all people want the same thing. And a big part of that is dignity in their life. And if you have nowhere to go and you feel that you're going to have no opportunities to go into a career, well, to your point, what else is there, right? And so P2A is a program that continues to grow. It's part of our project labor agreement. It is very, very successful. And again, just on a very personal note, in talking and getting to know so many formerly incarcerated or justice-involved individuals that have had this opportunity to see how, I mean, they have literally, you know, in conversations cried because they never thought they would ever be able to get out of the system. But that opportunity changed their lives. So I am a firm believer that what the city needs to do, and I'm pleased that the project labor agreement reflects this, but we need to invest more into job creation and not just, you know, $15 an hour jobs. I'm not talking about those jobs. I'm talking about jobs that people can, family sustaining jobs that have medical coverage, all these issues, you know, all the health issues, all the things that are going on. And then I'll be quiet. It all goes back to poverty. It all goes back to poverty. So as a worker advocate and a labor leader, I believe that opportunity, getting into the middle class, pursuing that dream that we all have is the answer. And I think there's a lot we can do together.
Gary, can I just say that in my career, I've done many panels, and over the course of the last, I guess now nearing 7 months, I've done many Zoom panels. Never once have I cried on a panel. And I think you've got me tearing up and more, because you're speaking the truth, and it's and people need to hear it, and I appreciate you doing so.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you very much.
I was just looking, Gary, as you was talking, the partnership that we have. Fortunately, we have a hard skills training program in construction, and one of the things that it does, and you're absolutely right, it provides livable wages for its employees, and
Right.
that's why those men were so emotional when they got an opportunity, because it's just not about the job, but it's about, can I care for my family?
Right.
And you look at, and this goes back to Jennifer's question, statement around institutional racism and poverty. When you look at the federal income levels, right, for poverty, 12,000, somebody making $13,000, they consider not in poverty. How can someone live on $13,000?
Not possible.
It's not possible. It's like $8 an hour. And so those are the kinds of institutional barriers that we need to knock down. And your industry, thank goodness for you, and your industry has helped many, many people build into the middle class. So thank you.
Thank you.
Gary, you're making people cry on the panel today. I love that. No, but that's so important. You and I have talked many times that, you know, the Carpenters Union lifted my father into a career and out of poverty. And so this is a testament for a lot of us that are on the discussion and tuning in. So we're almost to the end of our discussion. I want to be sure to, if any one of our viewers have any questions, please put them in the chat box and we'll try and get to them. But kind of an open question to everyone. How can society better support formerly incarcerated individuals who have fewer employment opportunities because of their criminal record?
Taking Gary's lead. Just he wrote the playbook.
I agree. That's the answer. We have to have policies in this city, and we have to demand of employers that they create opportunities for justice-involved individuals. And where there is city investment, it has to become a priority.
I do want to chime in just very narrowly on, since we're talking about the jails program, to make sure I say, first of all, we're also very happy about the new PLA. We're going to be able to use it. We're even thinking about whether this program is sort of so standalone and monumental, we should build it's a standalone PLA for it that's based on that PLA, but goes beyond it. Also, we've been working really hard on that question of encouraging hiring and employment for justice-involved folks. So going to do that through expanded Hire NYC, encouraging our builders in the contract language. We've been talking to our Small Business Services Department about temporary workforce one centers. And of course, again, encouraging and requiring expanded pre-apprenticeship programs along the lines of what Gary's talking about. So that's all got to be part of this program for all the reasons that have been discussed.
Let me just add one other thing that I think is important in the world we live in today. We've supported over the years, and I think it makes sense, all kinds of expungement legislation, meaning that you can't keep people from having jobs, but say, wait, make one mistake in their life and allow them, particularly when some of these mistakes were made as in a youthful indiscretion, that in a not a major issue, and we have to find ways for people to take away the blots on their record and make them unemployable. You know, that life isn't over because you make one mistake. And that's when we talk about expungement. That's what we mean. Clean up your criminal record. Provide maybe after a certain number of years, it goes off your record, or certain types of crimes, or certain forms of rehabilitation. I think that's very important too, to get people into the job market and not blackball them for life and consign them to a life of misery. Instead of the kinds of things that Gary is talking about, you get people into programs and let them start to live meaningful and rewarding lives. And I think everything we can do to not just throw people in the trash bin and say your life is over and that's it, you'll never, have a job, you'll never do anything meaningful again. I think that's important too.
Amen.
And I would add, there are organizations like the Fortune Society. We see 8,000 people a year coming through our doors looking for a better life. Many of them come into our employment services program. You can partner with organizations like Fortune to create a pipeline of qualified, experienced, skilled people that are ready, willing, and able to go into the workforce.
Excellent. This has been an excellent discussion. We do have a question for anyone to answer, perhaps for Jamie. How will the injunction by Judge Kelly against the Manhattan facility possibly impact the program?
Yeah, thanks. So there was a decision that we just received it yesterday, so we're still studying it and understanding its implications. I will say, as an administration, we were surprised and disappointed by the decision. Of course, litigation is part of it, moving any major project forward, but we were surprised and disappointed by this one. We do plan to appeal. We believe we have a very strong case. And at the moment, the decision won't necessarily impact our timeline because we're able to proceed with all of our construction and design activities, and we fully intend to do so.
I think the city will probably have an automatic stay of the judge's decision once they appeal. And as Jamie says, I think the timeline basically moves forward, and the courts, who obviously I respect so much, it will play itself out. I mean, that's what this is about, but there's no reason why this should delay our moving forward. And I think that that decision, without in any way speaking to the correctness or not of the decision, then seemed to take into account the design build requirements, which are very important. And one of the things that the decision talks about is the finality of the New York project, the New York County project, and that's built into design build that it can't be final, given the design build the protocols. So it remains to be seen what happens with the judge's decision, but certainly from the Rikers Commission perspective, we encourage the city, and I know they have absolutely this intention to move forward and let the appeals process take its course. That's what our democracy is about. That's what the courts are about. And certainly appropriate to bring litigation, certainly appropriate for every judge to make the decision they think is right on the law, but certainly also appropriate for the city to move forward at this point.
Judge Lippman, you have left me at least with one of the most memorable sound bites of our conversation today, and that is Rikers is a stain on the soul of our city. With that in mind, and as final thoughts for our panelists, even with the fiscal challenges that are facing the city, why is it critical that we continue to move forward on the plan to close Rikers and replace it with the borough-based jails?
Well, I'm just going to use, may I just say one thing, Judge?
Gary.
Briefly? I'm just going to use one word. It's called humanity. That's why it's critically important. It's called humanity. That's all.
And I would add to what Gary's saying, that in this time of all others, where we see what's happening around the country with cries of racial justice and what's important, this is the most important thing. It is the humanity. It is the moral soul of our city. This is what we're about, and it's more important than ever. This is the single most important thing we can do to move this city forward. And it is the absolute best way we could spend our money. And again, in the end, I think we'll save money, but it's critical for all the moral issues which are at the forefront of everything we should be doing in this city.
And I'll add, closing Rikers Island isn't just about closing Rikers Island. Closing Rikers Island is the city saying we are no longer going to perpetuate the mass incarceration system. We're going to reduce that system, and we're going to take, and this is what I'm hoping, we're going to take the savings, as Judge Lippman had talked about, and reinvest those savings into communities so that we don't have the poverty and disparity that we have economically and socially in this city.
So thank you very much to our distinguished panel. I have to give you a virtual round of applause to Jennifer, Gary, Judge Lippman, Stanley, and Jamie for a impactful and rich discussion on the importance of moving forward with our borough-based jails program for the city of New York. Thank you very much for coming today. Just want to remind everybody, sorry. Yeah.
So thank you.
Yeah, this has been great. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I just want to remind everybody that our Ascend program is going to continue, and AECOM will be having their Sustainable Vision for Rikers Island webinars this Thursday and Friday. So you can look online for connections to that. Thank you so much. Thank you to our sponsor, Turner, for today. What a phenomenal discussion, and everybody have a phenomenal day. Have a blessed day.
Bye-bye.
You too.
Thank you
Thank
very
you all
much.
very much. It's been a pleasure and an honor.